Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of currently streaming horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews may include mild spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy. For today's episode, I'm joined by friend of the show, Danny, to dissect Jordan Peele's visionary horror debut feature, Get Out, starring Daniel Kaluuya and Allison Williams. Danny, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How's it going?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
Not too bad. I'm excited to talk about today's movie because it's one of those movies that I recommend to everybody that sees it, whether they're fans of horror or not, kind of like yourself. Like I know that you're not the biggest fan of horror movies or like horror movies at all, but I feel like this is one of those movies that is really great for kind of bridging the gap for people that kind of want to like dip their toes a little bit into the horror genre. It's a blending of a couple of genres, but it's definitely horror-centric, to say the least.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of horror films. And that's why I kind of put this off for, 3 years. Mm-hmm. But after watching it, the first thing that came to my mind was I related this to Shutter Island.
Oh, okay.
It's got elements of horror, and it's almost portrayed as a horror film, but it's more thriller than horror. The horror part is just, the music and how certain scenes are played out. The suspense gives it that horror horror feel. But the whole aura of the movie, at least for me, it was more of a thriller.
Yeah. And
I relate that to Shutter Island a lot because, there are parts where, there's a lot of similarities. In the beginning of the movie, they walk in and you see all these people looking at Chris. Everyone's looking at Chris kind of awkwardly. And it's just like in Shutter Island, where as soon as Leo steps onto the island, everyone's kind of looking at him like
eyeballing him.
Yeah, so from the get-go something's going on. So
yeah, that's a fair comparison in terms of just like you're kind of introduced to this character and then that character's dropped into this world where something seems off, even though people aren't necessarily like actively hostile towards them. It's still like they're being watched, like they're a specimen almost. And it's up to the viewer to kind of try to uncover what that mystery is in a lot of ways. And that definitely ties into like the thriller aspect of the movie, where I would agree also Get Out is stylistically and atmospherically very much a horror movie. But at the same time, it really has that kind of investigatory element where you're trying to just suss out why certain characters are acting this way and kind of like seeing behind the curtain, as it were, for the inner workings. But for people that haven't seen Get Out, Get Out's currently streaming on video on demand, and it's very much a cautionary tale of the Black experience in white America, as our protagonist Chris visits his white girlfriend Rose's parents for the weekend. Their weekend retreat grows from playfully awkward to sinisterly disturbing as Chris uncovers the true purpose of their weekend getaway. So this is definitely, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it as somebody that has never seen this movie, especially somebody that, like you said, is not typically keen on these types of movies. So what was your initial reaction to finishing the movie or to experiencing the movie?
It literally reminded me of Shutter Island, like I said. That was the first comparison that I made. Both I was a little hesitant on watching, but after a lot of recommendations from my friends at that time, I watched it, Shutter Island and this. And I find those two films to be a lot of similarities. And there were a few horror-esque parts, but nothing like over the top. Is this actually defined as like a horror film?
So Jordan Peele describes it as like a horror thriller in that he has a lot of like horror influences. And that's also one of the kind of themes of Daily Horror Habit that I discuss with guests sometimes, is that it's like, it's our interpretation of what is scary. So sometimes non-traditional movies, one of the guest or myself will consider to have horror elements. So in that regard, I like to be open to conversing about them. Like a mutual friend of ours, Alex, picked Annihilation to talk about, which is a sci-fi movie that isn't traditionally a horror movie, but we had both agreed that like there are definitely some horror elements of that film. And so for those reasons, I think it's a pretty good fit for the show. And already there's the genre of horror kind of restrictive to some people. So I like to be open in terms of like, hey, I consider some moments of this to be horror. You might not, but we can still kind of talk about it under the same lens.
Yeah, I think the horror aspects of it heavily depends on who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Because just to reiterate your point, certain elements to some more than others would identify as horror.
Yeah.
But I would definitely say this is more of a thriller, because not everyone likes horror, but I think everyone can enjoy a good thriller.
Yeah.
So if this movie was described to me in the beginning as a thriller, I would have, watched it a lot sooner.
I mean, then again, on the other side to that is like maybe trying to investigate a little more into certain movies that are described as horror to see if it could be a film that kind of bridges the gap, such as this. Because like this is one of those movies that when it came out and I saw it, as soon as it was available on video, I shared it. I invited people over and I tried to get as many people to watch it. It was like I shared it with both sets of grandparents. I shared it with friends similar to you that don't generally like horror movies, but the film itself, Get Out, is such a strong blending of, like you said, thriller, horror, but also like there's a lot of humor in the movie. And that's something that we'll get into in a little bit, but it just shows that it's very accessible in a way that I don't think a lot of movies that are under the umbrella of horror generally are. And in terms of just like, for me, I would say right from the opening of the movie, I would describe it as a horror movie because of that opening scene. That scene where we have Lakeith Stanfield, Andre, who's walking down the street and a car starts following him. And then he's like, fuck that. You're not going to get me. He's like muttering to himself. And then he changes direction. And when he turns around, the car door is open and there's no driver. But then all of a sudden he gets blindsided and the guy chokes him out and puts him in the trunk. And it's like, that abduction is very much like a horror moment to me, especially when you can't see the antagonist's face. He's got this crazy medieval helmet on, and it's like you have zero context for what's happening. So for that's like a very strong kind of horror opening for me.
Yeah, I agree with that's a staple of a horror scene.
Mm-hmm.
I always look at the first scene of a film and how it ties into, like, I feel like the first scene of a film is, if you were to boil the entire film down into like one scene, the first scene would be it. Like it's like the thesis. Like that's how I kind of look at it sometimes. And that's how I felt this film was. If you look at, the plot, this is what happens, in the movie, essentially, is they kidnap people, and you find out later on, what they do, but that's a perfect example of that. And then another scene is when they're driving to upstate New York and they hit that deer, and Chris walks out of the car and then goes to see it. Like that's foreshadowing like what's going to happen to him.
Yeah. I think it shows, again, like it's such a remarkable film on its own, but then when you realize that this is a directorial debut, like it's so insane to me, the layers of foreshadowing that are in the film and the sort of the little Easter eggs that you don't pick up on the first time. Like I think I've seen this movie probably 6 or 7 times since it was released. And every single time I watch it, I pick up on something new. So like you said, that scene is a really great indication of not only foreshadowing for what Chris is about to experience, but at the same time, there's a parallel between that and what we later learn about it happened to his mother. Like his mother was a hit and run victim, basically. And he feels very remorseful because he sat at home waiting on her, and then she had survived initially. So she ended up bleeding out because nobody was looking for her. So that's one layer. But then something that I picked up on also is like after they hit the deer, they call the police because that's what you do when you hit a deer. Yeah. And Allison Williams' character seemingly steps up for him when the cop is like, I need his license, I need his ID. And she's like, why do you need his ID? He wasn't driving. He was a passenger. And it gets into the first instance of like a very contentious race relation moment, which we will get into more, and which is kind of at the core of the film. But on a rewatch, I realize that Allison Williams' character is not standing up for him so much as she doesn't want a paper trail that he was with her in that weekend.
Yeah.
Because as we learn what's going to happen to him, he's not meant to leave this family home later in the film. So this idea that like there's a paper trail of his whereabouts would be very difficult for the family.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense now that I think about it, because it's like, if you look at two other missing, or the three other missing, well,
there's a couple.
Yeah, it's all suddenly they're gone. You know, they were doing something, and next thing you know, no one's seen them for, a couple weeks.
Yeah, so I mean that again, this just speaks to how strong of a filmmaker he is that for his first film, I mean, granted, he'd been writing this film for a number of years. Like he said, I think in an interview, he started writing this movie when Obama got elected, basically, because this movie was a reaction to, there was this idea that like once we got an African-American president, that all of a sudden racism was gone in America. And it's very clearly right now, like that's not the case. And we're so far removed from an Obama presidency. And so his frustration with the guys that all of a sudden a black president cured racism in America, which is not the reality, he said this film was a reaction to that. So to see him kind of have all of these multi-layered storytellings tied into this very nuanced commentary is just like astounding that he was able to do this on his first film. And his first film would go on to win an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay, I believe.
I think we've all known how good of a writer he is, especially from his Key and Peele days. For his directorial debut, I mean, that's something. His ability to establish this feeling from the get-go as a brand new director. I mean, I'm sure he's directed some smaller stuff like TV shows and all, but to do it in like a full theatrical film,
right?
Wow,
Yeah, and I mean, something that he's referenced, and that even the producer Jason Blum, who's in charge of Blumhouse, the production company that does all the big horror movies now, like they did The Invisible Man, they did the Halloween reboot in 2018. They had said like there's a lot of parallels between horror and comedy. So for him to have a background in comedy is not that strange to dive into horror, because timing is everything in a lot of ways. So it's like whether it's timing for a joke, which obviously anybody knows that the backbone of a good joke is the punchline and having timing. It's the same thing with a thriller or a horror movie, in that the scares and the jump moments need to be paced well enough that they're not overbearing, so you become desensitized. They need to be smartly kind of implemented into the narrative, so that way every time they happen, they catch you off guard a little bit. And to master that pacing on the first effort of directing a feature film and having this important commentary tied into it, I just think it's remarkable. His
directing ability is phenomenal after watching this film, but I appreciate his story writing even more. I mean, the whole plot was, I mean, you could kind of tell something was going on. You just didn't know what, and you knew it involved, a racial element. There was a racial element to it. Yeah, but the way he builds it up is really good.
Yeah. So what was the first scene that kind of stood out to you as an example of there's something kind of like nefarious going on in the backgrounds? Because again, like the film begins and nothing like super sinister is happening. Nobody's aggressive towards him, but everything feels like it's off a little bit. Like there's something behind the scenes, like there's gears that are turning to set something into motion, and you just don't know what that thing is.
I would say when he first arrives at the compound, at the house, and he sees this groundskeeper, and the look that he gives him was like, you don't know what you're about to get into right now. It's like
Walter. Yeah,
Walter he gave him that look, and he was like, whoa.
That's a fantastic point, because Walter's played by an actor named Marcus Henderson, and he gives one of the most subtly creepy, well, I don't know if it's subtle, but it's one of the most obviously creepy performances of the film, but it's not really easy to describe why it's creepy. Because it's not really that he's saying something creepy or that he's being overtly creepy. He's just like very off-putting in terms of just being like unsettling.
I would say his low keyness
Yeah.
Establishes the creepiness of it. Because like
Yeah.
he doesn't say anything, and it's purely physical. Like he just gives them that look, like facial, like stone cold face, but the eyes, like obviously, we find out later in the film he's been completely hypnotized and had a cycle transplant, whatever, all that other stuff. So it's like he's not himself, but his eyes when he looks at Chris, it's kind of like that's the real Walter looking at Chris, like giving him a warning. But his his body, everything else is just like being controlled by someone else. Yeah. And that was the first sign, like, hey, you are walking into a lion's den. Like you're about to you're about to go through something you don't want to go through.
Yeah, Henderson described it as the note that he got from Jordan Peele on his demeanor should be one, it's like a child that has a secret that they can't tell. So he kind of like, he's like very kind of like, he's being coy about the fact, and he can barely contain the secret that he has. And we know what the secret eventually is, but he does such a good job of kind of just like showing that childlike restraint in that it's almost like killing him not to like gleefully tell him what the secret is, because, which again, like on this rewatch, I found his character and Georgina's character to be much more sinister because they know and they obviously don't give any warning, verbal warning. And it just becomes that much more sinister where it's like the danger is hiding in plain sight, basically. And they don't give him the benefit of the doubt. They don't give him a heads up or anything. And just that level of deception to me is super disturbing. It's almost more disturbing than the operation that we learn about later, just because it's like he's walking into the lion's den and the lions couldn't be happier to have a new lamb going to the slaughter, as it were.
There's a similarity that I draw between this film and The Joker with Joaquin Phoenix. With Joaquin Phoenix, think of both movies as a glass cup filled with water. And as the movie progresses, you see cracks develop. And then at the end, the glass shatters and you find out what's going on. Like, for instance, in The Joker, you see him mentally start fracturing. And then, at the zenith of the film, you see him just completely, you see that glass, metaphorically speaking, just break and him becoming the Joker. Same thing in Get Out. You meet Walter, gives him that look. You see, a crack start forming on that glass. You meet Georgina in, her interactions with the mother and the father, and the looks that she give in her expressions. You see, more cracks start forming. And then obviously, that later that night, he sees Georgina, through the window. All of a sudden she's gone. And then Walter running, doing all that other stuff. The hypnotism, you see more and more of these cracks start happening until like the point where the glass breaks, metaphorically speaking, is when he gets tied up in the chair and the video is played in front of him. Then he like the gig is up, everyone knows what's going on, and it's just like, okay, how am I going to get out of this situation now?
Right. Yeah. I mean,
does that make sense? I don't know if that metaphor.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah. Because it really is this scene that's building. I would almost say like, yeah, I totally agree with your metaphor. At the same time, like it's almost like so much pressure is being applied to something that's condensed that by the culmination of all the events, and we learn what this massive plot is, or the secret of the film, basically. And that's when the compressed item is like there's so much pressure built up that it finally explodes and it's all out in the open.
It's like a supernova.
Terrifying, and it's like a supernova. It's just like this realization that this is what has been going on. It's one of those things that you could never guess in a million years. It's one of those films that's so wholly original, the racial components and whatnot withstanding. It's just this idea that like you'd never be able to guess this idea that, oh yeah, these white families have built up this secret society that is kidnapping black bodies and then putting the white consciousness into the black body, into these people's bodies. Like, it's just such an insane original idea that every single time I show this movie to somebody that has no idea about the movie, it just completely catches them off guard. And they always tell me, like, never in 1,000 years would I be able to guess the trajectory of this movie.
Well, I think based upon how the four African American actors are, you know, are portraying their characters, something is up. You might not be able to guess what the family are doing or have done to them, but something has been done, and it's just like trying to figure out, well, what do they do? Do they have something over them so that they're afraid to act as themselves, or like it's very clear something was done to these people so that they're not acting like themselves.
Right. Yeah. So now I want to take a minute to talk about the scene that I think is, honestly, I know you're not the biggest horror fan, so you might not have the same frame of reference for like just memorable horror moments, but I think anybody can appreciate this scene, and that's the hypnotizing scene. I think that is legitimately one of the best horror scenes probably of the last like decade. This idea that, so it's presented this idea that Rose's parents are capable, or Rose's mother, is capable of hypnotizing people. She uses it for her psychology and in meeting with patients and things like that. She helps people get over like smoking and all these different things. And then how subtly she begins to hypnotize Chris and just talking to him like she's a therapist and whatnot, and getting him to kind of like begin to reveal things about him that have nothing to do with his smoking. Like there's the guys that, oh, I'll hypnotize you, help you quit smoking. I don't want you smoking around my kid. But then she starts to kind of like talk to him about his past and his mother. And slowly we start to realize the influence that she begins to have over him, and that he starts talking about his mother and how she was a hit and run. But then the moment that you realize like something's wrong is when you can hear the rain in the background. Did you pick up on that?
Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So it kind of just like, it almost becomes less of a conversation and more of like, he's in a dream, because what his memories are beginning to bleed into real life. And then of course there's that gut punch moment where we realize like he can't move, and he just starts crying while he's talking about this. And then she does that thing where she taps the glass and she goes sink into the floor. And then he kind of has this moment where he literally falls through the floor into this, like, it's seemingly like endless space, basically, into the sunken place.
Yeah. So first of all, I didn't think that was a horror scene. Nothing about it had any elements of horror, at least to me.
You didn't think that was terrifying? The idea that you're paralyzed and then you fall into this nether realm, as it were?
Not really. To like, never in my, I don't know, maybe it's just me, I don't know. But she said something a bit earlier during the film about her treatments, and it was like, I can't, it's something about like going at someone's weakness, or underlying something about how she I think she was describing how she helped people quit smoking, or how her husband quit smoking. Like there was
finding
something,
their flaws or something to that extent.
Yeah, so she exploits the flaws and then somehow fixes it. But I knew he was being hypnotized as soon as she picked up that teacup and started stirring the spoon, and you hear that grinding of metal on china. And I know it because I do. It's like this. If you have like something in your hand, like a pencil or something like that, and if you have ADD, or if you're a little antsy, whatnot, whatever it is, you might start shaking your leg, tapping your pen, or doing something. And then I found some people don't like it. And then if you're in a meeting, if I'm in a meeting with somebody and I'm tapping my pen on the table, instead of listening to what I'm saying, you can see how their visual focus is now on the pen.
Right.
Their hearing now, to a certain extent, is hearing what I'm saying, but they're also hearing the tapping noise. Now your attention is divided.
Mm-hmm.
It
You have to have a center for that
so
hypnotism.
it's like, I think it's like suggestive. She was saying you need to be in a suggestive state.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to be in that suggestive state, she divides your attention enough so that you're in that suggestive state. Like if you're focusing on her hand moving the spoon, the sound of that spoon grinding in the cup, there's less of you paying attention to her voice and what she's saying.
Right.
And then obviously it's at night. He probably, wanted to smoke, didn't get a chance to smoke, just got freaked out twice. His mind's already divided, into several different points. And her doing all this, just makes it more annoying, separates his attention out even further to the point where now he is, in a quote unquote suggestive state. Now
right.
She's diving into, his deepest fears,
Mm-hmm.
And that brings
basically makes him more susceptible to her will.
Yeah, it's getting under his skin so that she can take control.
Yeah.
I've never been hypnotized. I've never gone through, I've never gone to a psychiatrist, but the closest thing I've done is only take a psychology 100 course. But,
well, the imagery of the teacup is so iconic now that's actually his production company. He has a production company called Monkey Paw, and they're like, at the beginning of films when they have that brief 3-second image that plays that advertises what the production company is behind the movie. His is literally a monkey paw, and it's stirring that cup. That's like how instantly iconic that scene and that imagery is. And Peele even said, again, to go back to this idea that every single thing it's effective at face value. Like that scene, for me at least, is very disturbing. And seeing that imagery of him sinking into the floor and this forever falling, and he becomes a passenger in his own body, basically, and not in control. But even in that, Peele has been very vocal about that scene is basically this kind of nuanced, multi-layer metaphor for this idea that there's a system that silences black voices, essentially. Even though Black people might be present, their voice and their ability to speak out, no matter how loudly they're speaking out against something, gets silenced. And this is obviously a very dark interpretation of that or depiction of that. But at the same time, the same message still rings true. And it comes back to this idea that the whole movie's built around, this kind of his frustration with this idea that an Obama presidency meant that some people would go on to say racism is no longer here. And again, it ties into the fact that sure, people might promote this idea that Black people are included more in certain discourse, but doesn't necessarily mean just because they're literally physically there, people are adding value to their voice or letting their voice be heard. So this is very much kind of an even more disturbing depiction of that within the film or commentary.
So you said there was something oppressing Black people's voice. Couple, in your last whatever. Isn't that suppression from society?
Yeah,
because that's
it's not a coincidence that the victim in the film is a Black man and the antagonists are all white. Yeah,
I'm not trying to blame it on anything. I'm just saying society as a whole, as portrayed in the film and in real life, was never ready, for equality. It wasn't built up for it. Yeah, it's a lot better than what it was, 200 years ago, but we still got a long way to go.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think films like this are, again, so you and I earlier were talking before we were recording, kind of just warming up and shooting the shit. I brought up this point that horror has always been an overlooked genre, but at the same time, horror has always been really important in film because it's used as a template to talk about topics that are uncomfortable. There's a lot of horror films over the years that have inserted political and social commentary into their films. Like, have, you know the film The Night of the Living Dead from back in the day, George Romero from the 60s? It
I've
was
probably heard of it. I don't think I've seen it.
right, but I assume that you had heard of it because it's like the first major zombie movie that like blew people away, not only in how disturbing it was, but also the film came out in the 60s, early 60s, and it was one of the first early 60s films that a drama or horror rather that had an African American in the lead. And he is the top dog that entire movie. He is the film begins with a white woman being viewed as the protagonist, but then 10 minutes into the movie, it becomes clear that this other gentleman is the real protagonist and he's African American. And the whole entire film, it's him telling this white family that they hold up in this abandoned farmhouse to get away from the zombies. And it's all about this white man trying to essentially abuse the black protagonist and telling him, like, this is how we're going to do things, this and that. And the entire movie, the black protagonist is like, no, like, I was here first. We're going to do what's safest for everybody, not what's best for you. And it very much is one of those movies that even today, it's very affecting because I could never remember a movie from that era that would feature African Americans talking to white people in a way that they were in power, and justifiably so in terms of that film or the role of that film. And so horror has always been a genre that is not afraid to tackle in subject matter like that because it's almost more palatable for people in terms of like the draw is, hey, Night of the Living Dead is a zombie movie. If you're into horror movies and you're into creatures killing people in horrific ways, you'll go see that movie. But the brilliance of that movie is that George A. Romero was capable of inserting important dialogue that for the period and even today in many regards is still not happening to the rate that it should be.
I'd say, doesn't that go hand in hand? The fact that, this black actor is the protagonist in a film made in the 60s, a horror film. Isn't that in and of itself ironic or a metaphor? Like, society at the time, wasn't, particularly accepting of African Americans at the, even still. And it's like, hey, we got a black actor who's the main protagonist, and it's a horror film. Mm-hmm. To a certain extent, you can even say that's the horror of itself isn't the film, but the fact of a black actor being the main protagonist.
So I forgot to mention his name. His name was Dwayne Jones, who is the lead actor in Night of the Living Dead. And very much this film, I think Jordan Peele is a lifelong horror fan, he said, and he's done multiple interviews where he lists off a lot of the different horror films that were influenced his filmmaking career. Night of the Living Dead being one, Halloween, the original being one, Candyman. And I think Get Out really serves as a film that can coexist within the same breath as a lot of those classic horror movies, in the sense that, especially in the conversation of black-led horror movies. And it's very clearly a horror film that subverts the tropes that a lot of horror movies had in like the 90s and early 2000s, where that joke, like the black guy dies first, like that's a trope that everybody's familiar with who's ever even glimpsed at a horror movie or something, because to the point that it was so common that it became like a joke and not a very funny one, but it became, people would like go around making that joke all the time. And I think this film really is able to do what every horror movie should strive to do in terms of like telling a disturbing creative story, but at the same time, there's more to it than that. There's a purpose that is almost greater than the subject of its storytelling.
Yeah, it's kind of like debunking a myth or a pre-notion.
Yeah.
It's
absolutely, yeah. I would agree with that. In terms of some of the other moments that kind of like stood out to you, what was another scene that kind of like shocked you?
The dinner scene. I mean,
the first one when everybody's drunk.
The first, yeah. like after the very first day, he meets the family, whatnot. The brother comes in, and then you kind of shift to the dinner scene. You know, you knew something was up when the dad's like, "Oh yeah, you know all this other stuff. Yeah, I would have voted for Obama for a third term." It's like, okay, come on, like saying that's too cliche. And then at dinner, the brother, he said, "It's like you like MMA." It's like no, and he's like, "Imagine you in MMA, you have the perfect physique and all this other stuff." And I'm like,
Starts talking about genealogy.
I was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" I mean, come on, like let's put the brakes there. But
Mm-hmm.
you know, Rose in the beginning of the film was like, "Yeah, you know, my family aren't racist or something along those lines." Really? What your brother just said
Right.
completely, you
Mm-hmm.
know, debunks, you know, that train of thought. Let alone, you
That's,
know, Georgina and Walter and how, you know, they were reacting and acting.
I mean, that's one of those main initial instances where you start to see the cracks behind the illusion that this family has been casting over Chris. And that, again, like the father's saying these things that are like very awkward, but at the same time, they're not really, it's kind of what you would expect somebody out of touch to say. Like he says, "Oh, I would have voted for Obama a third time." And Rose even gives him a heads up about that. And it's like, that's a goofy thing to say and it's very try hard, but that's something that generally if somebody said that to you, they were trying to come from a good place, even if it's kind of a misguided one. You know what I mean? But at the same time, as soon as like the brother Jeremy gets drunk, he starts his language becomes a little more sinister and a little more highly questionable, shall we say, when he brings like genetic makeup and genealogy and all of these kind of like that's taking it another step further, trying to like break down Chris as being a specimen when before he was being treated as a person to a certain extent, a black person. He wasn't just being like the family very much was treating him as like, oh, you're to a certain extent, I guess they were treating him like he's a specimen, but it was there was the illusion of kindness at least. Whereas now the brother is like, oh, your
Blatantly,
genetic
yeah.
makeup is fantastic for fighting and all this stuff. And it's just like, I'm a person. And now there's not that kind of like kind illusion of kindness over it. It's kind of like seeing the rawness of their thought process. And essentially their thought process is that he's not a person. He's a specimen.
Yeah, I think that right there at that scene, I was like, wait, something's definitely going on. Like, especially like you, that was a clear indication they did something, you know, physically to both Walter and Georgina
Mm-hmm.
for them to act the way they do. And then another scene when Chris, well, the whole dinner, the whole party, what is like,
Garden party.
yeah, that was more of an indication that something's going on. Like they don't see Chris, they don't even see him as a black person. Like they
Right.
see him as like an alien, like an extraterrestrial. Like what the hell are you doing? Like in the way they're
It's
acting and all that other stuff.
nothing is more standout from that scene than in that scene where all these weird white people have shown up and they're like trying to talk with Chris about trying to relate with him and all these different things that are just like so awkward and over the top. But that one guy says, for the last few hundred years, fair skin was fashionable, but now the pendulum swung the other way and black skin is in fashion. And it's just like,
What?
at that point, the illusion is almost completely shattered because you're just like, what do you mean in fashion? Like, what?
Yeah, at that point, it was like, okay, the gig is up. The only thing we got to know is what you're doing to these people.
Right.
You know, like that was.
I mean, that bleeds into, it's literally like an auction block in that all these people, it's a 21st century
literally.
like slavery auction block in that all these white people are coming through and they don't view him as a person. They view him as a thing basically that they can bet on and buy or
A
bid on
commodity.
and
Yeah.
buy. Yeah, as a commodity. And like one woman is like feeling up his arms. He's like, oh, he's very muscular. And then one guy is like an aged golfer who he's like tells, oh, I'm friends with Tiger Woods and all this stuff. And it's just like, Okay. And then it, of course, becomes even more and more sinister where we get that fantastic shot of Rose's father who's in the gazebo, basically, and it's like a close up of him doing a silent auction. And then as the camera pans out, you see he's standing next to a picture of Chris, and then you're like, holy shit, they're auctioning him off.
Yeah, like, let's go play bingo. I was like, okay,
Right.
bingo. He holds up a card, with, one bingo card with one line, filled out. Another person does it again. I was like, wait, this doesn't seem like playing bingo, especially when
Right.
everything's silent. And then as it zooms out, you find out, as you said, this is not bingo. This is a straight up auction.
Right.
Uh, you know Chris is the person being auctioned, but it's like you're still kind of wondering, well, what are they going to do to him? Like, what did he just buy Chris? He's not just buying Chris. Obviously, they're going to do something to him to make him submissive and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that whole ordeal, Chris goes back up to his room, and then Georgina is right behind him. And then you
Yeah.
see him start talking, and all of a sudden Georgina starts crying. That's almost
Mm-hmm.
like her original character just kind of snuck in there and then started crying. It's like, I need help. That's like a telltale sign something's not wrong with her. But it's like the grandma was in control, but the real Georgina is like, slipping out a little bit, trying to escape.
See, I interpreted that scene differently. I interpret it as, again, like a sinister moment where Walt and Georgina they're obviously Rose's. We find out that it's Rose's grandparents inside of these two people that Rose helped kidnap. I interpret it as the grandmother doesn't. She's like trying to hold back her emotions in the sense that, like Chris says, like, I get nervous when I'm around too many white people, you know what I'm saying, kind of thing. And the grandmother's so upset and she can't break character that she starts like crying because of like the restraint that she's showing. Like, I don't know whether it's because she's so angry
Really?
that like she just hates the fact that this black person is talking to her that way or what, but I always took it as like her holding back her anger. That's just how I interpreted it. Just because, again, like I find it so much more sinister again that both Georgina and Walter are very much aware of Chris's fate, and yet they do nothing to warn him. Obviously, they wouldn't, but it just makes it so much more sinister that this horrible fate this guy is about to succumb to, and yet they could have given him a heads up, but of course they don't.
Well, I never looked at it this way, but that's a very interesting take. But you see how what they're doing isn't perfect, because when Chris's camera goes off and that flash disorients one of the guys, he's like married to like
Andre.
what?
Andre? The one
Andre?
that gets kidnapped in the beginning?
Yeah, so Andre's married to, like a 60-year-old woman and all that other stuff. And then Chris's camera's flash goes off and then he starts panicking, the nosebleed and everything. From that little scene, whatever they're doing to these people isn't bulletproof. There are ways to get it out, whether it's something physical or psychological. It can be broken. So I see that as, well, if their method isn't perfect, that means, the original personality can there are cracks and it could kind of slip through. Mm-hmm. And I see, the opening scene with Walter giving Chris that look as one of them and Georgina crying as the other. Mm-hmm. I see it as, they're talking all that and Georgina's crying, like warning Chris, you have no idea what's going to happen. And I'm crying because I can't help you. I can't say anything to, warn you of what's going on. My tears are the only warning that I could produce.
I got you. I could see that too.
But that's I like how, wow, I never saw it as the grandma being angry.
Yeah, because like she disconnects his phone because she doesn't obviously want him calling for help or anything like that. So but again, I think this speaks to just how strong this film is that we can have two very valid interpretations of a single thing, and yet our interpretations of a small moment like that don't fundamentally change the overall movie.
It's
You know what I
like
mean? And I think
Black
that,
Mirror, that movie
yeah,
where it's like no matter what you watch, the story is still relatively the same.
right. And I
Well,
think that's really telling of a talented filmmaker in that we can have conversations like that, even for seemingly like innocuous moments in the film. Um, that's definitely a strong, I guess, just in general, like this film has such a strong cast across the board because Betty Gabrielle, who plays Georgina, like she doesn't have a lot of moments in the film, but every single moment she has is memorable. And it's
effective,
not always just because of what she's saying, it's like her physicality and her facial movements and things like that.
efficient. I think
Yeah.
people like Walter and Georgina don't have a lot of screen time, but the screen
Mm-hmm.
time they do have, the effect is very powerful. Their portrayal is very efficient. Whatever on-screen time they have, you know, is used very effectively and efficiently. Like small subtle actions, just build up the suspense and
So,
continue the
well,
story.
yeah, absolutely. So while we're talking about performances, what did you think of Rod, motherfucking TSA, who plays Chris's best friend, who's played by the comedian Lil Ray Howery? What did you think of him? Because he is very much the overt comic relief within the film,
Yeah, he's
obviously.
definitely the comic relief. He kind of he's he, he gives a pause in the film. Like I'm sure for a lot of horror films, there are instances where the horror aspect of it is gone and gives you like kind of a little rest. And Rod does that. He gives in that comedic relief just to relieves the stress, and the suspense before it starts building back up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Definitely, lighthearted, funny, and it's a good way to break up the rhythm and the flow of the film. It's not consistent. It's not like this roller coaster ride where you keep going up, and then it just drops. It's like, oh, you
Right.
go up, then you plateau. It's like, oh, wait, what's going on? And then you continue the rise. So
It really speaks to Peele's background in humor in that he knows when the film needs jokes. He knows when there's kind of lulls in the movie, or not necessarily lulls, I guess, but there's moment too much tension is never a good thing. So he knows when to apply certain comedic touches, and the comedic touches are all very much in line with what the film is generally about or its commentary. Like a lot of uh, Rod's jokes are all about like Chris is being kidnapped by a white sex cult. Like white people love hypnotizing black people and putting them in sex cults and shit. And like those kind of little moments are so terrific because the humor, even if it doesn't end up being what he says is not what's happening, at the same time, like it ties into this idea that like black people are skeptical of white people accepting them in a lot of situations. And the reason that's funny is that there's truth in what he's saying. Like
oh yeah, I mean he pretty much hit
people
it
are not, yeah,
like dead on, like even from a comedic standpoint. And we as audience know, like, you're close, but the fact that he can see it this far away,
mm-hmm.
as a third party, let alone Chris, who's first person in the situation. Um, but the way he does it, it's like the scenes with Rod are usually right after, sequences that build up a lot of suspense.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like this balloon, right? You pump a lot of air into it, it's already expanded. And before continuing with the suspense, making it even more and try to burst the bubble, you introduce Rod to, kind of let the bubble settle, let the balloon settle in with the pressure. And then after the whole comedic relief, you go back to the building suspense, and it's like that drop that
Yeah.
adds even more suspense to whatever has already been built.
There's a really fantastic, the scene that I never appreciated until my recent rewatch was the one where Rod actually goes to the police and he starts trying to tell the black detective like what's going on. And that scene I interpreted a lot differently, kind of like with all of the different uh, racial things that have been happening recently and like the friction between the police and different communities now. I was interpreting that scene as very different because you assume going into it like he was able to find the one black detective that would listen to him. that would share his views on white people and like suspicion of white people. And then because she's a cop, all of a sudden she has zero like sensibilities that she shares with him. This idea that like he's saying all these things about like the white people are kidnapping him and you got to watch out for the white people and stuff like that. And she's just like, okay, this is like a joke. Like she's not able to relate with him on any level whatsoever.
Well, when you look at it, she's working with a bunch of white folks in the
exactly.
and like two other white detectives, are in the background listening to this story. It's kind of like she's one of them.
Assimilated into it's like she's not even black anymore almost. It's more like she's defined as being a cop, and any sensibilities that she shared with him before that
out the window.
Kind of like dissipated. They've dissipated. She had to give them up to be a cop. That was just a random aside that I thought of while I was watching last night. But before we kind of like get into the conclusion, was there one other scene or anything you wanted to touch upon? Or you just want to dive into the conclusion?
Well,
or the end of the film.
we know like this film it's all fiction and whatnot, but what I don't know, how are you going to operate on a man? Open brain surgery in a basement that's not hermetically sealed, that's not sterile.
Danny, he's a doctor putting a white man's brain into a black man's body. So I think we're going to do away with any sort of scientific notions of accuracy in this.
I'm just saying, how are you gonna a scalpel? Yeah, you can cut off the skin off the top of your head with the scalpel, but you're not gonna cut the skull open with the scalpel. You need a saw for that, and I think you need to be very precise. Now, this is just me nitpicking.
A little bit,
because like how are you gonna cut the top part of a skull off without damaging the brain? And it doesn't seem like and a major surgery like that is not done by one person. You have you have teams of people doing it with equipment monitoring the physical status of the patient at all times.
I'm gonna chalk that one up to it's a movie, and I'm not gonna put too much thought into that because it's a nonsense operation to begin with.
Yeah, but obviously I know it's a movie and all that, but I saw it and I was like, wait, this movie obviously doesn't. Well, it wasn't meant to be medically accurate, but that was one thing that I saw. I was like, wait, no, this, those two lines do not intersect at all.
Well, so in talking about the conclusion, one of the scenes that I really, really love is when Chris is tied down to the chair in the basement and he's awaiting his operation, and he's doing that nervous thing that he does where he's scratching at the sofa. The arms on the chair, rather. And he ends up putting the cotton balls in his ears the next time that they think that they've hypnotized him. And then that's what he's able to attack Jeremy when Jeremy goes to move him into the wheelchair, and then he beats the shit out of him with the croquet ball or whatever, and then takes the cotton balls out of his ears. That was one of those moments, like, I was so happy I saw this movie in theaters the night it came out with a packed theater, because when that happened, everybody cheered. And it was just one of those really fantastic, it was one of those fantastic kind of community experiences in a theater that I don't usually have, because I don't like going to the movie theater, to be honest. I can't stand sitting around other people that are doing this or doing that. But this is one of those movies where it's so easy to cheer for the protagonist that when there's one of those oh shit moments he's not about to be taken advantage of and he gets like revenge finally, like that's an awesome moment in the movie for me.
Yeah, I like how the teacup now becomes a trigger. Mm-hmm. And his first thing was, don't let her start doing it.
Right.
Yeah. And then
he stabs the father with the deer antlers.
It gets pretty brutal at the end. I don't know why he didn't like take out Jeremy like permanently. He kind of just
that's one of those moments that I watched this with my brother last night, and that was a moment that we both were just like, you got to double tap my man there.
Yeah.
But then at least he doesn't kill him there. And then we get that very satisfying curb stomp, which was pretty well deserved, I would say.
Yeah, the ending overall, was pretty like. I never expected Rod to show up. Like I thought
that is one of my
I thought it was the police of the town seeing him. He's either a part of this whole thing or, you know, going to arrest Chris. And I was like, oh, so this is probably going to end with him either in jail or going back and getting, you know, whatever. Like it's like you think you're out of the hole, but no, something comes and pulls you back down into it. I never
Right.
expected, Rod to show up and kind of be like the comedic relief at the end to, end it all. Um,
Yeah.
it was a
That
nice change of pace. I mean, because usually when a cop shows up in that situation, you would think, well, you know where
well,
this is
he's dead.
going. Then you
Yeah.
open the door and it says TSA police. Oh, Rod, okay.
That was another moment where the entire theater started cheering because everybody has that moment where they're like, oh, he's fucking dead. Like he's sitting on top of her, choking her as the cop pulls up. And then the door opens and you see it's actually Rod. And you're just like, fuck yes. Because so there's a deleted scene for the film where it does end with it being an actual cop. Like they filmed that ending where it's just a regular cop and the cop arrests him. And then the film ends with Rod visiting Chris in prison, and they have a conversation between the plexiglass over the phone. That I don't. So I think that's too dour of an ending for this movie
That's
because,
like
like,
stereotypical Hemingway. Where the trajectory goes, it's too
right,
predictable. But with Rod,
yeah,
it's like, what the hell? Like,
and it ties into the comedic sensibilities of the movie. It's
yeah,
not a comedy by any extent, but at the same time, it does have a lot of humor in it, and it fuels into its feel good humor in a
yeah.
way that the entire movie is so oppressive of the protagonist that for him to take the kind of easy way out and be like, yeah, America's that bad, and then it ends up with him getting arrested, like it feels like it would be a little too much for this movie because the movie is it's so blatantly piling on its protagonist.
It's a happy ending.
And
It's like a fairy tale ending almost.
right. And I really think that that's what this movie needed. I don't think this is the type of movie that would benefit from I'll put it this way, like a nasty ending or not a bad ending. Cause I think I like movies that have endings like that, where it's like they say fuck it to their characters because this is the fate that they've been prescribed. But in a movie like this that dabbles in so much humor, I feel like it does need that last like holy shit moment that is super satisfying and again is super rewarding.
I feel like with a film that has this fucked up of a plot,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of, well, obviously the racial part of it adds even more to the fucked upness of it. You almost need a feel good ending to, uplift you from this, you know, really like wild roller coaster ride.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah, absolutely. Was there any closing thoughts you had on Get Out? I know it's a lot, and I think we covered a good amount. Uh,
I,
overall would you recommend this to other people?
I'd recommend.
Because I know that
I'd even watch it again. Um,
yeah. Oh, I'm
I,
happy to hear that.
I probably wouldn't describe it to people as a horror in the
Mm-hmm.
fear of it turning people off.
Mm-hmm.
I'd just say as a thriller. I'd even say,
Mm-hmm.
if did you watch Shutter Island? And if you liked it, if you watched it, this has got similar aspects. That and like
Right.
Stonehurst Asylum, things of that nature, where
I still need to see that.
it's kind of long. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah,
Not
that one is. I remember
it's a lesser version of those Shutter Island and Get Out.
if I've already seen the better version of that movie, I think I might just rewatch one of the two I've seen. But this is definitely a movie that is very rewatchable. And I went back and I was reading to supplement my understanding of the film and whatnot. After the first time I saw it, they recommended watching it and focusing on Rose the entire time. The second time you watch it, to begin to pick up on little nuances of the things that she does. Like that's how I picked up on the idea of her confronting the cop. It's not so much for Chris's benefit, like I had said, it's more her benefit. Just like there's little moments like that that really, really stand out. And I mean, I would love to have you back on and watch and talk about his Jordan Peele's second film, Us, which is more of a horror film, but at the same time, it's still very thriller esque. But I would love to have you on and talk about that sometime because I think it'd be interesting to talk about the things that he replicates from Get Out into Us, but also the ways in which he tries to expand his skill set in being a feature film director.
That's a solid movie to base your foundation on.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the way you described it, it looks like he took the foundation of Get Out and then remolded it into or rebuilt another structure on top of it for Us. I mean,
yeah, he extrapolates a lot of what was successful about Get Out, and he does experiment in some different ways with Us. And I was a fan of it, and I think since you would be willing to rewatch Get Out, I think you will enjoy certain aspects of Us that would want you to rewatch it, in terms of just like nitpicking, or not nitpicking rather, but picking certain things out of scenes like clues and whatnot. I think you would probably dig that more than some people that haven't been too keen on the movie because of those types of things.
the one thing I didn't like was how obvious some things are. That's probably
in Get Out.
In Get Out, yeah. Aside from the medical whole situation, the surgery, that's one thing I wasn't so keen on, was the fact that it was very obvious the whole family was up to something. They didn't downplay it. It was just about figuring out what they were doing. But I almost wish that they downplayed that a little bit. Don't make it so obvious. But once again, there was a reason why Jordan Peele wanted this fact to be so obvious to people.
Mm-hmm.
I just felt like if it'd be more of a horror and more sinister if he did downplay the fact that this family was doing these things to people.
My thing is that if they downplay it, then they have to spend more time getting to that. And so the more time that there is, like, this is such a brisk film. I think it's an hour and 40 minutes or something like that, or an hour and 45. But it's one of those movies that is so brisk that I feel like anything that deviates from what we got would just drag it out to a point where it's like, we got it. Like, we got to get to this faster. And I think, especially when he has something important to say with the movie, the brisker, the better, in terms of not bogging down either the message or the entertainment value of the movie.
Yeah, I mean,
that's like a personal thing.
This is just me nitpicking, but the length of the film, really, like, nothing was dragged out longer than it needed to be. The pacing, everything was good. I'm just saying, like, if he wanted a more of a horror and have a more sinister, then yeah, tone it down. But overall, I liked what he did with the film.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that. I'll make sure to start describing more horror movies I enjoy as thrillers to get you to see them.
Don't tell, like, you described Us as horror first, and that's probably why I haven't watched it yet.
Well, maybe in the future sometime I'll get to have you back on and we can chat about it. But I appreciate you taking time out of your day to come chat about Get Out.
Thank you.
No problem, man. Anytime. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Daily Horror Habit podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service and follow @Daily Horror Habit on Instagram or @Daily Horror Pod on Twitter.